Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Doug Austin, CEO of Strategic Source. We're glad you decided to join us today. This is part 4 of our dealership profit improvement series. The focus today is going to be contract management and compliance audits, keeping suppliers honest. Hope this will help, especially in this time right now of kind of runaway inflation. I would imagine all of us are seeing price increases come across. There may be contracts guiding those activities. So we want to make sure that we've got some policies in place. We're managing contracts and ultimately we're doing some audits to keep suppliers honest. I don't think suppliers are intending to cheat anybody, but it's a good idea to keep an eye on at least some of the high cost expenses to make sure that costs are where we think they should be. So we'll get started here right away. We're going to have this webinar wrapped up in 30 minutes to be respectful of your time. Again, some of the topics that we're going through, first part 1 was low inventory, part 2 was inflation, part 3 was top 20 cost reduction, and today we're at contract management. We're actually changing session number 5. And the focus of that is going to be a little bit later in July, but it's going to be the status quo is the enemy. I would really encourage you to join us for that one. That's going to be a quick one as well, but that will be inserted as number 5. A little bit about us: founded in '92, veteran owned, full service spend management partner. We do complete analysis, planning, sourcing, process, audit. We're experienced in about 130 expense categories. We support about 1,300 locations today. Our sourcing team, our management team, has about 220 years of experience. We don't know it all, but we know quite a bit. And we're averaging 24, actually last year, 27% cost reductions for our clients. What we'll learn today, we're going to talk about mitigating risk, contracts and agreements, recommended contract strategies, supplier audits, and then we'll kind of summarize everything here in 30 minutes. And I'm going to take myself off this so that you can see more of the screen. So spend management has been described by many as the last gold mine for management to control direct and indirect costs. Most of the categories that we focus on are in the indirect side that don't influence the parts that you bill back to clients, but there are a number of those that we do impact. Here's some dealership facts. This is pertinent to all dealerships. In fact, I just had a phone call an hour and a half ago, and our metrics really hold up. Dealership spend is roughly 5% of total annual sales. So if you've got a $100 million dealership, you're probably going to spend $5 million. You're going to spend it across 130 expense categories. We've seen typical single point dealers that have had 400 suppliers covering those 130 categories. We've seen some that have 4,000 suppliers, which really doesn't make any sense. And we've even seen one that had 25,000 suppliers for a big mega group. So keeping your suppliers narrow is a cost-effective strategy and improves your leverage. We know that there's an opportunity to reduce costs 25%. We've been achieving that for at least 10 years in the dealership space. Prior to that was 23 to 27 and back again, but 25% is a good objective. We know that 95% of dealers have decentralized purchasing, meaning that different department managers in the organization are managing different buckets of spend. Could be the CFO, could be the office manager, parts manager, service manager, general sales manager, but that's what decentralized purchasing is. There's not a purchasing department that's kind of controlling all that. That's what we do for our clients. We help consolidate all that and bring that into one consolidated plan with kind of a methodical approach to go after that. And we do know, lastly, that any reduction in costs in a dealership is going to go directly to profitability. It's going to drop to the bottom line. So some of the current business challenges, you probably don't need me to reiterate this, but purchasing is decentralized. And because that is, contracts typically are scattered. They're not well known. Purchasing policies, again, because we're decentralized, may not exist to reduce organization risk. I missed a space in there. But policies help to inform the employees in terms of what to do, what they can't do. And I would really encourage you to have purchasing policies in place. Number three, the risk of contracts auto renewing is very real if they're not tracked and managed. And four, supplier compliance is unknown, costing dollars in current times. So if you're not auditing suppliers, if you're not auditing invoices back against contracts, you're likely spending too much. We have seen, because we do a fair amount of audits here, that roughly 10% of the line items that are invoiced on vendor invoices are inaccurate. Now, sometimes they favor the dealer, meaning the vendor is charging too much, but most of the time they're charging too much. So vendor audits are an important part of managing your spend effectively. So our objective here is to mitigate risk and improve supplier compliance. So number one, we're trying to mitigate and eliminate contract risk. We're trying to improve controls. We're trying to simplify contract management. And ultimately, we're trying to improve supplier price compliance. We want costs to go down and profits to go up. So what are the strategies? Well, I recommend getting purchasing policies in place. Not only policies telling folks what they can and can't do, but also approval limits. There are three ways to spend money in any organization, whether you're a dealership, a manufacturing company, a nonprofit, and that is through a purchase order, a contract, or invoice approval. What we like to recommend is that there's an approval matrix set in place. On the left-hand side of that matrix is the title of the person. It could be the owner, could be the president, CFO, director of whatever, fixed ops. And then in each of those three spend buckets, contract, PO, and invoice approval limits, and I'll show you a chart of this, put the dollar limits that they can sign up to. Obviously, the president and CEO can approve unlimited dollars in most organizations, but we want to get those policies in place and approval limits as well. Number two, we want to centralize the storage of all contracts, probably with the CFO or the controller. What does that mean? Well, we could have a hard copy of that contract online. We could have a hard copy in a file cabinet, but they should all be in a central place so that we can put our hands on them if we need them. My advice, organize them by vendor name alphabetically. But number three, if we can get a contract tracker in place, the best advice is to get the name of the vendor in that contract tracker, but then get the expiration date of the contract tracker as well. So if the expiration date is 9/15/2022, we want to probably have an alert that comes out about 90 days ahead of time that says, hey guys, your contract is coming up. It's time to so that we can prevent an auto renew, probably time to open conversation with that supplier and see what we can do in terms of negotiating price, terms, service levels, and so forth before that contract automatically renews. The fourth strategy, again, is very important. Begin auditing supplier compliance. Well, which ones? Well, we probably want to spend our time on the DMS, uniform, phone contract, the high dollar tickets, and not worry too much about the company providing water bottles and first aid. Now, if you've had experience with overcharges there, then that's certainly important. But if you've got limited time and resources, which most dealers do, my advice is to start focusing on the largest spend categories first. So as you centralize spend management, what we're trying to do with purchasing policy is to set guidelines or parameters. What can the employees do? What can't they do? And I think most of your employees will appreciate that. They don't want to violate company policy in most cases as it relates to suppliers, but it's our job as leaders to say, these are the limits that you can operate in. You're free to bring suppliers in for meetings, but if you're going to add that supplier to the company supplier base, that has to be approved by Mary or by Sam or by so-and-so, so that we don't balloon that supplier base out of line. Those purchasing policies will define and articulate some of those requirements. This is a draft set of purchasing policies here. Obviously, space doesn't allow me to go through all of it, but what is the purpose of the policy? What's the philosophy? The philosophy could be something that we always want to get 3 to 4 written quotes on any supply, service, or piece of equipment. We want to go out for quote with an RFQ every year on expenditures over $50,000 or $100,000. School districts and government entities have bid requirements where they actually are required to go out to bid, and the implication there is that low cost wins. Well, I don't particularly like bids. I like RFQs because it gives you a lot more freedom. But I would certainly encourage any group, whether it's a dealership or a nonprofit or a manufacturing company, to regularly quote expensive recurring items, whether it's services, supplies, and whatnot. The use of purchase orders, we might want to call that out in our purchasing policies. I encourage you to use a purchase order as a confirming device, not after the fact. So we agree with the supplier that we want to buy 10 widgets at $10. You confirm that with a purchase order, and then based on that purchase order, the supplier executes and fulfills that PO. When the product comes in, we check it off against the PO. We check the invoice against the PO to make sure that everything lines up. We want to have approval authorities, again, purchase orders, contracts, and invoices in that policy as well. Here's an example of the approval matrix that's kind of inherent in a set of purchasing policies. You'll notice here that we have the titles on the left-hand side, and then we have a bucket for contracts, POs, and invoice approvals. Many organizations don't call this out, and they let everybody sign off on invoices that come in the door, and that's where a lot of fraud occurs. So my advice is stipulate contract limits, PO limits, invoice approvals. In a dealership, you may have technicians and service writers that are writing POs. They're writing a PO for a tow truck. So you got to keep that in mind too. Anybody that's approving dollars, a commitment of your financial resources should be laid out here. Then ultimately, when we have the purchasing policies defined or articulated, we want to make sure that we, every once in a while, bring that to the employees in employee meetings so that they know what authority they have and what limitations they have. And it's also a good idea to put a copy of those policies in any new hire packet so that when a new manager comes on, they realize that they have this authority and this authority is limited. I really encourage you, if you have a lot of turnover in your dealership, you want to constrain the ability of new management hires to add suppliers to the database. We have seen this time after time where the general manager is replaced, a new one comes in, the new general manager has a buddy that offers killer deals and phone services. They bring a new vendor on, and all of a sudden you've got 2 vendors in telecom. We've also seen where the company has forgotten to shut off that original vendor after they've been replaced, and we've seen companies that have paid 2 vendors for the same phone lines. So this can really get out of whack the vendor base, the payment base, unless you've got this tied down. So again, my recommendation is get these approval authority limits built into your purchasing policies and get that implemented across your organization, especially if you have multiple locations in your group. We like to build a contract tracker. It's a simple tool. We know there's software out there that you can buy and you can spend $2,500 a year on a contract tracker, and that might be a good deal. You can do it as simply as setting it up in Outlook. Reminders, if your contract expires on July 31st, set that as an expiration date, but then go back 90 days earlier than that and set a reminder that your contract is coming up. The other way to do that is a contract tracker. We build this ourselves. If you notice on the left-hand side, we have the vendor name, we have a brief category description, we have an origination date of the agreement, we have an end date. We've identified whether this contract has an auto renew feature. I'd encourage you to scratch that out in any contract with any supplier, but there are some that are just going to insist on it. And we just have to understand that. In every contract, they should have a notice provision, termination notice, 90 days, 30 days, whatever. And then we certainly build in the review date when we want to review that contract prior to its expiration. And then we build in a PDF copy of that online so that somebody could go in here and say, okay, I want to take a look at my ADP contract. All the essential details is right here. And you can do this in Excel. We have this built into our own software. And then we've also got a copy of it online. So if you wanted to look at that ADP contract, a PDF would be available. So again, my advice is centralize your contracts, get the hard copies into a file cabinet, ideally with your CFO or your controller, but then get this contract tracker built. That should reside on the desk of the same people and maybe your management team too. Now we know that because dealerships are decentralized, the fixed ops manager might have some of these contracts, parts manager, excuse me, parts manager may have some, various managers may have contracts. If that's your process, good for you. But my advice is get a copy of that contract and get that centralized and then get it online. Every once in a while, and I would recommend every 30 days that you do a audit of suppliers. You could take something as simple as the contract document. If you look on the left-hand side of the screen, look at the items that they're selling you, the unit of measure, the price that is quoted in your contract, and then the price that you actually have seen on your invoice. Compute the delta in terms of dollars and the percentage difference. My advice in doing this is we want to compare the pricing. We want to review that supplier spend, but we're just trying to validate, is the vendor charging us the right price? Is that T1 line truly $300 a month, or is it $320? But you can do this in a simple Excel chart like this. And I've set this up for supplies, but you can do it the same way for services. You can also use the same kind of document to benchmark prices across your organization. If as you're looking at quoting suppliers for different supplies and services, use the same kind of head-to-head comparison to do that. But it's also a useful tool in your audit activities. When you complete your audit, it's good to have a kind of a summary that you can kind of report back to management. That's what this is. This is one of our own internal forms. This shows that we audited a uniform company. You can see up in the top, the category is uniforms and laundry. We found that there was 95% price compliance here. What does that mean? Well, if there are 100, maybe there are 110 items on the invoice, 95 or roughly 96% of them were accurate, accurate against the contract, accurate against the RFQ, but there were some discrepancies. And when we total those up, it showed that the vendor owed us the vendor owed us $515. So we want to make sure that now that we've audited, we've done the comparison of the price against the contract, we now want to make sure that we go back and summarize that. And then somebody ought to be charged with going back to the supplier and say, I'm sure this is an honest mistake. You haven't charged me correctly on these 10 line items, whatever they are. And we see that we are deserving of a $515 credit. What's kind of interesting here, and we've seen it in the uniform category, is once you notify a supplier that you've audited their invoices, they're going to be much more careful going forward. So you sent a very strong message that you're not just letting these things slide by. You're not receiving them, initialing them, sending them up for payment, but you're actually checking them. The other thing that we found that I wouldn't have guessed is that sometimes suppliers will say, we're really sorry for this mistake. We're not only going to refund you this $515, but we're going to go back and audit another 3 months or 4 months or something like that. And when they do, that $515 credit may turn into $800 or may turn into $1,000. We had a situation with a big group in the West a couple of years ago. We had done some audits, and then we hadn't done any in that category for a while. And it turns out that in that interim period between other categories, because we are working on 130 categories, but when we got back in the audit function, we found some discrepancies. The vendor went back, we went back, and we found out that there was about a $14,000 credit due back to the vendor, which was a nice surprise. So, at that point, we learned that we need to stay on that supplier a little more often than we had. We found the initial discrepancy, but there were a number of historical discrepancies that we needed to reconcile. So, what is some of the financial impact of all this? Well, certainly managing contracts will certainly minimize auto renewals. There are, I'm sure, hundreds of price increases going on right now. When in dealerships alone, you are probably buying 10,000 supplies and services items. When you think of the shop supplies, office supplies, janitorial, detailing, all those SKUs, and then you think of all the services that you're buying, there's probably 10,000 items that you folks are paying for on a monthly basis, that are aggregated into those 200 invoices. There are going to be price increases there, and some of them are justifiable. Transportation has gone up. Transportation costs will go up. Fuel surcharges are going to increase. But, it's one thing to increase the fuel surcharge this month, but every other month after that, building from 0 to 10% might be unacceptable, and you want to compare that back to your contract. So you are getting price increases. I will bet dollars on that. We worked with a number of suppliers for many years, certified suppliers. We're getting notified of that. I think in most cases, it's honest, it's realistic. But on the other hand, if you can go in and maybe renegotiate with that supplier, go out for quote, find some other suppliers that might be hungry for the business, you might be able to mitigate those price increases, or certainly eliminate them altogether and maybe get some price decreases. Our practice shows, second bullet point, that roughly 9 or 10% of the invoices, and when I talk about invoices, they have incorrect pricing on them. And I'm also, what we're talking about here is the line items within those invoices. So look at your uniforms, look at your telecom, see if the suppliers are sneaking anything in on the invoices that weren't originally contracted for, and call those out. The potential risk avoidance, the cost savings of $100,000 a year. Now, these are overcharges, prevention of auto renewals, price increases that you find are not unreasonable. $100,000 a year on a $50,000 dealership, I would say are pretty realistic. So if you're looking for found money, dig into those invoices, dig into those contracts, check them out. And remember, a $50 million dealership is probably going to spend 5% or $2.5 million on services and supplies. Typically, we find 25% of that is available in terms of cost reduction. So out of $2.5 million, do the math, you're probably looking at $700,000 that are available to your store and cost reductions. You want to certainly mitigate risk, go after those contracts, make sure that they don't auto renew, and try to prevent any price increases that might be slipping by. Avoid these obstacles. Again, get the purchasing policies and approval levels in place, gather and centralize those contracts, get those contracts into a contract tracker. You can do that in Excel. You can do it in Outlook. We'd be happy to help you with that. We have an automated solution that you will be able to upload your contracts and put them right into our contract tracker with a little bit of help. So we can help you with that. And then fourth, begin auditing your suppliers, especially your high cost, your DMS, your phone, uniforms, your digital advertising. But make sure that you get those invoices audited, and then make sure you go back after the refunds that are due you. Do it in a professional way. Again, I don't think this stuff in most cases is intentional. So some of the key presentation takeaways: decentralized operations create risk. You just need to know that. Contracts should be centralized. They ought to be tracked. Policies with approval limits need to be implemented. They provide guardrails for employees. Suppliers, high cost suppliers should be regularly audited. And doing so, preventing those auto renewals can bring a lot of dollars to your bottom line. Strategic Source, a little bit about what we offer. We offer profit improvement programs. We can do spend analysis on the front end. We can augment your team if you have a purchasing department. We can do some contingency cost reduction. We have an expense portal that we're ready to roll out here very soon. That is a low-cost subscription base, is kind of the do-it-yourself approach. And we also teach what we do, spend management learning. So we can help you in a number of ways if you need that. If you want a copy of this presentation today, because this is a good cure for insomnia. If you can't sleep tonight, read through this. I guarantee you might pull out some good information, but it will help you get some rest. It's a good cure for insomnia. But we can be happy to share a PDF of this. Text us at 612-386-3898. Just ask for a copy of the presentation. We'll get that off to you right away. Or email caustin@strategicsource.com or myself, daustin@strategicsource.com. I think we've got a question here, and I'm going to go up and see what that is. Okay. Question is, how often do you audit suppliers once you begin that cycle? I would suggest that you audit. What we do is what we call a discovery audit. We do an audit of a supplier usually 90 days after implementation. So you want to get 1 or 2 billing cycles in place. And if there are errors there, if there are significant errors, 2% or more, then I think you got to get back to the supplier, let them know, get it corrected. But that might tip your hand that you need to audit them a little bit more regularly. If you do that discovery audit right away and you don't see any errors, I would drop them off for maybe 6 months. If you do see errors, then we jump into what we call recovery audits. which means we're going to audit them more often until they get their act cleaned up and get the errors eliminated. So that's a good question. Are there any other questions out there? You can send it in. Okay. Doesn't look like there are. Oh, shoot. Let's see here. Well, with that, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it. If you have questions or if you'd like some help, we are here to help. We have a lot of resources, a lot of content, a lot of tools that can help you. But we really appreciate you joining us today, and I hope the strategies and tactics that we gave you will be helpful to you as you try to get your contracts in line, kind of audit your suppliers, and get and bring some dollars to your bottom line, but more importantly, get some guardrails around your spend organization and really reduce and mitigate risk. Thanks for joining us. I hope to see you next time for session 5. You don't want to miss that. Status quo is the enemy. We're going to talk about change management, what the opportunities are, and what the costs are for doing nothing on your expenses. Look forward to talking to you again. Thank you.